I killed Grandma this morning, not with poison or a pillow, but by ignoring her single, trembling voice commandment about a godforsaken mirror hauled now into my new, echoing apartment, hers, technically, left vacant by her sudden, quiet passing last Tuesday. The keys cold and heavy in my palm as just yesterday. The stale scent of lavender and something vaguely medicinal clinging to the faded wallpaper as I shoved boxes marked "Kitchen Fragile" across scarred oak floors, echoing with absence. The mirror, a monstrous, oppressive slab of antiquity dominating the dim living room wall opposite the bay window, overlooking a rain-slicked, deserted Philadelphia street, was the only thing she'd ever truly forbidden. Never move it from this apartment, Sarah. Promise me, swear on your mother's grave, the hinges won't hold the weight of consequence elsewhere. Her roomy eyes wide with a fear that seemed ludicrous then, just senile superstition. But now, as I stood dwarfed by its gothic, worm-eaten mahogany frame, thick with dust-caked cherubs, caught in silent, agonized screams and sinuous, thorned vines carved with unsettling precision, a cold dread, utterly irrational, began seeping into my bones like groundwater. And cover it at night, child. Always cover it. Thick cloth, no peeking, no matter what whispers you think you hear scratching at the glass. She'd rasped, her papery hand gripping mine with surprising strength. A final, desperate plea before the morphine drip stole her coherence. Ridiculous, I thought, patting her knotted hand, dismissing the ramblings of a dying woman, haunted by old-world fears, a relic herself in this bright, digital age. After all, it was just glass, backed by silver, heavy, yes, impossibly heavy for its size, when the mover strained and cursed maneuvering it. Up the narrow stairwell, leaving sweat stains on the ornate frame, but still, just an object. A beautiful, if morbid antique, reflecting my own tired, 29-year-old face, framed by messy auburn hair escaping its ponytail, my practical blue sweater, the unpacked chaos of boxes behind me, my reflection, familiar, mundane, except 3 nights in, bone-tired after assembling IKEA furniture under the flickering overhead bulb, I dropped a screwdriver. My reflection in the mirror, caught in the periphery as I bent to retrieve it, stayed bent a fraction of a second longer than I did. A subtle lag, like bad video streaming, straightening up only after I was fully upright. A chill skittering down my spine, despite the radiator's clanking heat. I blinked, shook my head, blamed exhaustion, the strange acoustics of the empty room. The next day, brewing coffee, I caught my reflection mid-yawn, mouth stretched wide, and as my real jaw snapped shut, the reflection's lips curled upwards, not in a smile, but a grimace of pure, unsettling malice. The eyes dark pits, devoid of my own hazel warmth, holding my gaze for one paralyzing heartbeat before snapping back to perfect mimicry, leaving me gasping, coffee sloshing, scalding onto my hand, the mundane scent suddenly cloying. Wrong. That night, ignoring the prickle of unease, I deliberately left the mirror uncovered, defiant against the childish fear taking root, burying myself under Grandma's old quilt on the lumpy sofa bed, flashlight clutched like a talisman, determined to prove it was just stress, grief, the unfamiliar shadows of her life now imposed on mine. Sleep was a frayed thread. The radiator hissed. Floorboards settled like groans. Then, movement. Not in the room, but within the mirror's depth, glimpsed through slitted eyes, feigning sleep. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, gliding sideways through the reflected living room behind my sofa's image, featureless, silent, gone before I could fully focus. Another shape, lower, crawling, insectoid, skittering across the bottom edge of the glass, vanishing into the dark corner of the reflected wall. My breath hitched, frozen in my throat, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't sleep paralysis. I was wide awake, rigid with terror, the flashlight's plastic casing digging into my palm. A low, subsonic thrum seemed to emanate from the mirror itself, vibrating in my molars. A sound felt more than heard, a hungry purr. The shadows coalesced, swirled, became figures, indistinct, shifting, but undeniably humanoid shapes, pacing, pressing against the glass from the inside, their movements agitated, desperate, silent screams etched in the tension of their postures. One stopped, directly behind my reflected head. A dark hand rising, fingers splayed, pressing against the glass as if feeling for warmth, for purchase. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulled the quilt over my head. A child's defense against the monstrous, the muffled fabric, amplifying the frantic drumming of my own pulse. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, my dreams were corridors of glass, distorted reflections clawing at me, Grandma's voice echoing from impossible distances. "Cover it, Sarah, cover it, now." I woke with a jolt, gasping, drenched in cold sweat, pre-dawn gray light filtering through the bay window. Relief washed over me. Just a nightmare. A horrific, vivid nightmare fueled by stress in that damn mirror. I pushed myself up on one elbow, rubbing my gritty eyes, turning automatically towards the oppressive slab dominating the wall. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't me reflected back, staring out from the glass, eyes wide with abject terror, mouth stretched in a silent, ear-splitting scream, fist pounding frantically, uselessly against the inside of the glass as if trapped in a soundproof cell, was my grandmother. But not the frail, white-haired woman I'd buried. This was Grandma, as I'd only seen in faded, sepia-toned photographs. Young, vibrant, maybe 25. Her dark hair styled in soft waves, framing a face contorted by pure, unadulterated panic. She wore a floral print dress I vaguely recognized from an album, her knuckles white and reddened from pounding the unyielding surface. She was screaming soundlessly, her eyes locked desperately onto mine, pleading, begging, a silent movie of utter horror playing out inches from my paralyzed form. Her fist slammed against the glass again, a tremor I felt resonate in the floorboards beneath me, her mouth forming words over and over. "Help me, Sarah, get out." The reflection wasn't mimicking me, it was her, trapped, preserved in the terrifying bloom of youth, living a moment of pure terror on an endless loop, imprisoned within the cold silver and glass. The truth detonated in my mind, cold and absolute. The mirror wasn't haunted. It was a predator, a soul trap. Grandma's warnings weren't superstition. They were desperate survival instructions, hard-earned knowledge passed down, perhaps from whoever had cursed this thing before her. Covering it wasn't about blocking spirits. It was about starving the thing, denying it the connection, the reflection it needed to what? Lure? Anchor? Feed? Her frantic pounding wasn't just fear. It was a final, decades-late warning to me. The granddaughter who'd scoffed, who'd ignored the plea, who'd left the gateway uncovered. Never move it, because moving it might break whatever fragile wards or bindings contained its hunger within these walls. Cover it at night, because darkness amplified its power, its connection to wherever there was. The heavy frame wasn't just wood, it was a sarcophagus lid. The intricate carvings weren't decoration. They were binding sigils, warnings, or perhaps even instructions now lost to time. The lagging reflection, the malicious smile, the shadow figures. They weren't ghosts in the mirror. They were other victims, other souls ensnared over who knows how long, flickering in the trapped energy, the residual echoes of their final moments before the glass swallowed them whole, leaving only this terrifying, eternal snapshot of Grandma's final trapped scream. Her young face, frozen in that rictus of terror, was the moment it took her. And now, it saw me. It had my reflection. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. I was frozen, not by fear alone, but by a horrifying realization. My own reflection was still absent from the glass. Only Grandma's terrified visage filled it, pounding, screaming silently, her eyes boring into mine with desperate urgency. But as I watched, paralyzed, a dreadful change began. Around the edges of her trapped image, the reflected room behind her started to distort. The familiar lines of Grandma's old armchair warped and stretched like taffy. The light from the bay window bled into unnatural, bruise-like purples and greens. And behind her pounding fists, the darkness within the mirror's depth seemed to deepen, to solidify, forming shapes far larger, far more menacing than the skittering shadows from the night before. Hulking, indistinct figures moving with deliberate slowness towards the glass, towards her, towards me. The low thrumming intensified, vibrating the floor, the sofa, my very bones, rising to a subaudible growl that felt like it was scraping the inside of my skull. Grandma's pounding became frenzied, desperate, her silent screams now directed not just at me, but at the approaching darkness behind her. Her eyes darted towards the encroaching shapes, then back to me, filled with a new, profound horror, the horror of something imminent, something worse than her eternal prison. They were coming for her, again, and they saw me watching. The cold dread solidified into a leaden certainty, covering the mirror now. Wouldn't save me. The connection was made. It had tasted my reflection, my fear. It knew I was here. I was already in its gaze. The antique wasn't just Grandma's legacy, it was her damnation, and now it was reaching for me, its glassy maw hungry for another soul to join the silent, screaming gallery trapped within its silvered void, forever pounding on the wrong side of the glass. The air grew thick, cold, smelling suddenly of ozone and old dust and something metallic, like blood. The figures behind Grandma coalesced, reaching shadowy limbs towards her frantic form. Her eyes met mine one last time, filled not just with terror, but with an unbearable pity. Then the glass rippled like dark water, and she was gone, swallowed by the advancing darkness within the mirror. For one horrifyingly silent second, the mirror showed only a swirling, ink-black void. Then slowly, indistinctly, my own face began to form in the center of the glass. But it was wrong, slack, eyes vacant and black. And behind its shoulders, barely visible in the churning gloom, loomed the immense patient shapes, waiting. The thrumming rose to a deafening roar inside my head. The apartment walls seemed to pulse. I couldn't look away. The mirror held me, its new tenant, reflecting not the room, not my terror, but my inevitable screaming end, already captured within its ancient, hungry heart. Grandma's final, silent warning echoed in the crushing silence. Get out. But it was far, far too late. The reflection solidified, my vacant eyes staring back, a puppet strung by the darkness behind the glass. The pounding started again, but this time, the fists were mine.
Story number 2.
The first whisper came from Emily, barely 5, pointing a chubby finger towards the shadowed alcove beneath the basement stairs of their new, far too affordable Victorian in upstate New York mere days after the moving trucks groaned away. "Mommy, who's the sad old man living back there? He looks cold." Sarah and Ben exchanged the indulgent smile of rational adults, dismissing it as the vibrant imagination of a child unsettled by the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the century-old house settling into its bones, the oppressive silence of rural darkness pressing against the windows, a stark contrast to their cramped Brooklyn apartment. "Just shadows, sweet pea." Ben ruffled her hair, though unease, faint and unwelcome, prickled his neck as he glanced towards the impenetrable gloom beneath the stairs, the air suddenly feeling denser, colder. The shadows deepened. Then Emily's beloved stuffed rabbit, Mr. Flopsy, vanished from her pillow one night, only to reappear days later, perched impossibly high on a dusty shelf in the unused attic crawl space, its glassy eyes staring blankly down, one ear slightly torn, smelling faintly of damp earth and something metallic, coppery, that made Sarah gag. Unexplained sighs, like weary exhalations, echoed from empty corners when Sarah was alone folding laundry. Phantom coughs rattled from behind closed closet doors late at night, jolting Ben awake, heart hammering, flashlight beam cutting uselessly through the dark, revealing nothing but dust motes dancing. Their normally placid golden retriever, Duke, refused point blank to enter the basement laundry room anymore, whining piteously, hackles raised, tail clamped firmly between his legs whenever the door was ajar, growling low in his throat at the pantry door for no discernible reason. Frustration mounted as keys perpetually went missing, reappearing in the freezer. Sarah's favorite earring turned up inside Emily's closed toy oven. Ben's watch was found submerged in the dog's water bowl. The house felt watchful, resentful, the atmosphere thickening with an intangible malice that seeped into their bones, stealing sleep, fraying nerves. Exhausted and spooked after a particularly bad night of disembodied scratching sounds emanating from within the walls of Emily's room, Sarah confided in Mrs. Henderson, the octogenarian neighbor who'd lived on the lane since Eisenhower, over weak tea and slightly stale cookies. The old woman's rheumy eyes widened, her papery skin paling further. She leaned close, her whisper dry as autumn leaves scraping concrete, laden with a fear Sarah hadn't anticipated. "Oh, child," she rasped, clutching Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "That ain't just pipes or mice. That's your brownie. Or what was your brownie? Sounds like he's turned right sour, mighty angry." Sarah blinked, unfamiliar with the term. "Brownie?" Mrs. Henderson nodded gravely, her gaze darting towards Sarah's house, as if expecting something to be listening at the window. "House spirit. Old ways. My granny talked of 'em. Helpful little fellas if treated right, but cross 'em, neglect 'em." She trailed off ominously. "Granny said, if it turns spiteful, you gotta appease it, like the old country folks did, before it gets worse, much worse." Her voice dropped even lower, conspiratorial, urgent. "Milk, fresh, in a saucer, good bread, just a piece. Honey, maybe. Leave it out at night, near where it dwells. The basement corner, the pantry, wherever feels wrong. Show respect. Say you mean no offense. Might calm it. Might just." Desperate for any solution, any semblance of peace, Sarah and Ben, clinging to skepticism but worn thin by fear, decided it couldn't hurt. That night, With a nervous giggle that felt hollow in the heavy silence, Sarah placed a small china saucer of whole milk and a chunk of crusty artisan sourdough on the worn linoleum just inside the basement door, whispering a hesitant, "For you, peace." The effect was immediate, profound, and utterly deceptive. The next morning, the milk was gone. The saucer licked clean. Only crumbs remained of the bread. The oppressive silence lifted. The scratching stopped. Duke tentatively entered the laundry room again. Keys stayed put. Laughter, tentative but real, returned. For 3 blissful days, the house felt almost normal, the dread receding like a bad dream. Relief washed over them, warm and intoxicating. They'd done it. Silly superstition, but it worked. Their triumph was short-lived. On the 4th morning, the saucer was empty again, but placed precisely in the center of the kitchen table. Beside it lay Emily's half-eaten strawberry Pop-Tart, the one she'd left on her plate the night before. A chill unrelated to the autumn air seeped into Sarah's gut. It wasn't just accepting. It was demanding, choosing. That night, feeling foolish but compelled, they left out a fresh saucer of cream in a slice of Ben's expensive smoked ham. Gone by dawn. The following night, the offering vanished. But Emily's brand new, glittery unicorn hairbrush was found lying in the saucer's place, sticky, with something dark and viscous that smelled faintly rotten. Then her favorite picture book appeared, splayed open on the basement stairs, its pages ominously smeared with greasy fingerprints that were not human, too long, the knuckles too pronounced. The demands escalated, turning predatory. Not just food, but Emily's things. Her toys began disappearing. A plastic teacup, a fuzzy bear, a sparkly hair clip. They'd reappear days later, broken, soiled, placed deliberately where Emily would find them, under her pillow, inside her school backpack, once nestled in her booster seat in the car. Each returned item felt violated, carrying a psychic residue of cold malice that made Emily whimper and refuse to touch them. The sighs returned, louder now, wetter, accompanied by a new sound, a low, guttural clicking, like bone on bone, coming from the space behind the ancient, rarely used fireplace in the living room. Duke regressed, cowering constantly, urinating indoors in terror whenever the clicking started. Ben found deep, parallel gouges scored into the hardwood floor outside Emily's bedroom door one morning, as if something heavy with claws had been dragging itself back and forth all night. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced their initial relief. Appeasement wasn't working. It was fueling it. The thing was tasting their fear, savoring their compliance. Its true nature was emerging, shedding the flimsy disguise of the helpful brownie Mrs. Henderson had described. One frigid night, Sarah awoke gasping, a weight crushing her chest, the sour stench of decay filling her nostrils. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. In the moonlit gloom, a shape darker than the surrounding shadows coalesced near the bedroom door. Impossibly tall, spindly, its outline suggesting elongated limbs and a head that lolled at a sickening angle. It emitted a low, satisfied rumble that vibrated in her bones before melting back into the hallway darkness as the paralysis lifted, leaving her trembling and drenched in cold sweat. The next day, Emily, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear too old for her years, tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The sad old man. He's not sad anymore. He looks hungry, and he says he wants to play with me. Really play. In the dark place under the house." She pointed towards the basement door. "He says he's been waiting a long, long time before the big stones." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Before the big stones. The house was old, but the land was ancient. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed with terrifying new meaning. What was your brownie? This wasn't a displaced house spirit turned sour. This was something else entirely. Something primal that had lurked in the bedrock, in the deep, cold earth beneath the foundation stones long before the first timber was laid. The old ways Mrs. Henderson spoke of weren't instructions for a grumpy domestic sprite. They were accidental protocols for something far older, far hungrier. A ritual that hadn't calmed it, but recognized it, acknowledged its presence, its right to be there. The milk and bread weren't appeasement. They were an invitation, a confirmation of its dominion. They had unwittingly opened a door, feeding its strength, its audacity. Now, sated on cream and ham, it craved more potent sustenance, the vibrant, terrified life force of a child. Its whispered demands to Emily weren't requests. They were declarations. The scratching at her door wasn't random. It was a countdown. The thing from under the house, wearing the stolen mask of a brownie, had been patient for centuries. Its time, fostered by desperate parents following a dangerous, misunderstood echo of a ritual, had finally come. The silence that followed Emily's revelation was profound, broken only by the frantic hammering of Sarah's heart against her ribs and the dreadful knowing whine from Duke, crouched low under the kitchen table. Ben's face, drained of all color, mirrored Sarah's dawning, horrific comprehension. The rational explanations, the dismissive smiles, the comforting lie of childhood imagination. They lay shattered like the saucer they'd so carefully placed. They hadn't calmed a household spirit. They'd roused a slumbering predator, validated its claim with other offerings, and now it had tasted their compliance and craved their child. The dark place under the house wasn't just the basement. It was the network of crumbling stone foundations. The root cellar dug deep into the unyielding clay, the suffocating earth itself, the entity's true domain, where the weight of centuries pressed down and the cold seeped into your soul. That night, they barricaded Emily's door, not with furniture, but with salt hastily bought from the overpriced local health food store, drawing clumsy lines Ben found described online in a frantic, sweat-slick search for warding against ancient entities. They hung iron horseshoes found in the cluttered garage above every doorway, their cold metal feeling utterly inadequate against the creeping dread. They left nothing out, no offerings, a silent, terrified revocation of their unwitting pact. The house reacted with furious malevolence. The temperature plummeted, their breath frosting the air despite the furnace roaring. The sighs became guttural growls. The clicking transformed into a rhythmic thumping against the basement ceiling directly below Emily's room, shaking the floorboards, vibrating through the bedposts. Objects flew, not misplaced, but hurled. A heavy candlestick narrowly missed Ben's head, embedding itself in the drywall. Sarah's favorite vase exploded against the fireplace hearth. Doors slammed shut with bone-jarring force, trapping Sarah in the linen closet for 20 suffocating minutes until Ben could wrench it open, finding her white-faced and shaking. Worst were the whispers, not just to Emily anymore, but slithering into their own minds as they lay rigid with terror in their bed. the darkness thick and suffocating. Voices that mimicked loved ones. Sarah's deceased mother calling her name mournfully from the attic. Ben's brother chuckling darkly from the empty shower stall. Twisted, distorted promises. And chillingly, Emily's own voice, sweet and clear, singing nursery rhymes from inside the locked pantry. They found her one morning, sleepwalking for the first time in her life, standing blank-eyed before the basement door, her small hand turning the knob. They barely caught her as the door swung open on its own, revealing only yawning blackness and a wave of that same rotten, metallic stench. Emily's drawings changed. Gone were rainbows and smiling suns. Now crude, disturbing sketches filled her notebooks. A stick figure girl holding hands with a towering, shadowy shape composed of jagged lines and too many grasping limbs. A dark pit under a house filled with staring eyes. Herself lying very still in a corner while a shadow thing loomed over her. A single, huge, jagged-toothed mouth open wide. When asked, she'd just whimper and point downwards. Mrs. Henderson stopped answering her door, her curtains perpetually drawn, a palpable aura of fear emanating from her previously welcoming cottage. They were on their own. Research became their obsession, a frantic scramble in the scant hours when the oppressive activity lessened, usually just before dawn. They unearthed fragmented local lore, buried in digitized archives of the County Historical Society. Vague references to the Deep Cold One. Whispers of settlers abandoning farmland in the early 1700s, citing illwites and earth grumblers. A chilling diary entry from a long-dead pastor mentioning a malignant presence drawn to the despair of the displaced, mistaking appeasement for obeisance. The truth crystallized, cold and sharp. This entity wasn't bound to their house. It was bound to the land. The house was merely its current hunting ground, its antenna tuned to the fear resonating within its walls. The brownie myth was a dangerous misidentification, a comforting label slapped onto something incomprehensibly older and ravenous. The old rituals weren't solutions. They were shackles humans had naively offered, binding themselves to the entity's will. Offering milk wasn't tradition, it was tribute, and they had paid it willingly. The final demand came not through whispers or misplaced toys, but etched with something sharp and foul into the frost that coated the inside of Emily's bedroom window one sub-zero morning. HERNOW. Below the words, drawn with disturbing precision in the condensation, was a crude symbol resembling a twisted root or a clenched skeletal hand. The air hummed with violent intent. The thumping below Emily's room became a constant, jarring drumbeat. Duke howled incessantly, clawing frantically at the back door until his paws bled. Lights flickered wildly, plunging them into terrifying darkness, filled with skittering sounds and guttural breathing that seemed inches away. The barricades felt like tissue paper. The salt lines seemed to sizzle and thin before their eyes. They knew, with chilling certainty, that their time, the entity's enforced patience, was over. The tribute had been accepted, the contract established by. Their desperate ritual was being called due. The thing from under the stones, the false brownie, the deep cold one, was coming for its promised payment. Packing a terrified Emily in a whimpering Duke into the car was a blur of adrenaline and primal fear. Ben fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life like a defiance in the silent, watchful darkness of the property. Sarah clutched Emily, who buried her face silently in her mother's coat, her small body trembling uncontrollably. As Ben threw the car into reverse, headlights slicing through the pre-dawn gloom, the porch light exploded in a shower of sparks. At the same instant, every window on the house's front facade imploded inward with a deafening crash of shattering glass, as if struck by a massive, invisible fist. From the jagged, gaping holes, a wave of profound, unnatural cold rolled out, visible as a roiling mist that crawled across the frostbitten lawn towards the idling car. And within that mist, darker shapes seemed to writhe, suggestions of elongated limbs, a hunched, too tall silhouette in a chorus of wet clicking sounds that cut through the rumble of the engine, vibrating in their teeth. Ben stomped on the accelerator, tires screaming on the gravel as he wrenched the wheel. The car fishtailed, then lurched forward down the long tree-lined driveway. Sarah dared a glance back. The house stood shrouded in the unnatural mist, the broken windows like black, screaming mouths. And framed in the shattered maw of the front doorway, barely visible in the retreating headlights, stood a figure. It was impossibly tall, its form indistinct, shifting, but radiating pure ancient hatred. It didn't move to follow, it simply watched them flee. Its posture wasn't one of defeat, but of cold, patient certainty. The message was clear, echoing in the sudden, oppressive silence that filled the car as they sped onto the main road, leaving their nightmare address behind. Run. Hide. It doesn't matter. You acknowledge me. You fed me. You bound yourselves to me with your fear and your ritual. The child is marked. The land remembers. I am older than your roads, deeper than your foundations. I am patient. I am hunger. And I always collect what is mine. The road ahead was dark, empty. The car felt fragile, a tin can hurtling through an indifferent void. Behind them, swallowed by the night and the suffocating mist, the house waited. And beneath it, in the deep, cold earth, something ancient and ravenous stirred. Its appetite merely whetted, its claim irrevocable. The false brownie's game had only just begun.
Story number 3.
The silence, after years of emptiness beneath me, was pure bliss. A thick, comforting blanket settling over my creaky old Victorian apartment. Finally, someone quiet had moved into 1B after the last tenant's chaotic departure. No thumping bass, no drunken arguments echoing up through the floorboards warped by time and neglect, just blessed absolute stillness that made the nights peaceful and deep, the kind where you truly appreciate the sanctuary of home. His name was Mr. Armitage, introduced himself with a soft, almost whispered voice, and a brief, skeletal handshake when I bumped into him carrying groceries. A gaunt man with eyes that seemed perpetually adjusted to dim light. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp features, dressed in neat, slightly dated clothes that hung loosely on his frame. He apologized profusely for any potential disturbance. His smile a thin, fleeting thing that never touched those sunken eyes, assuring me his habits were nocturnal and utterly silent. A promise that felt like a gift in this paper-walled building where every footstep overhead was an intrusion. For the first week, it was heaven. The profound quiet from below felt restorative, like the house itself was sighing in relief. The only sounds, the familiar groans of ancient pipes and the wind whistling through the loose sash windows. My sleep undisturbed, my reading hours blissfully free of jarring noise, lulling me into a sense of security I hadn't known since moving in. Then, late one Tuesday, The scratching began. Not loud, not intrusive, but insidious. A faint, persistent scritch, scritch, scritch directly beneath my bedroom floorboards, like long fingernails being dragged slowly, deliberately across the plaster ceiling of 1B. A sound so intimate it vibrated up through the soles of my feet resting on the worn rug, stopping my breath cold as I lay rigid in the dark, straining to hear if it was just the house settling or perhaps a rodent, though it felt too rhythmic, too intentional. It lasted only minutes that first night, vanishing as abruptly as it started, leaving a void filled only by the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs, a cold sweat prickling my skin despite the room's chill, the silence now feeling heavy, watchful, charged with an unsettling expectation. The next night it returned, slightly louder, starting precisely at 2:17 a.m. A slow, grating drag that seemed to trace a path from beneath my dresser towards the foot of my bed. Screech, pause, screech, each pause a held breath, each scrape a violation of the fragile barrier between his space and mine, a physical manifestation of intrusion that turned my sanctuary into a cage suspended over an unknown pit. I convinced myself it was pipes, old wiring, anything but what it sounded like. Human nails on plaster, burying the rising dread under rationalizations, focusing on Mr. Armitage's impeccable quiet during the day, his brief, polite nods in the hallway, his closed door always an impenetrable barrier. But the sounds evolved. The scratching was joined by a soft, wet shushing, a sound like something heavy being dragged very slowly across rough carpet, a sound that seemed to originate not from a single point, but moved, fluidly, sinuously, across the entire ceiling of his apartment, pausing sometimes directly beneath where I stood, frozen in my kitchen, or sat paralyzed on my sofa. A sound that hinted at impossible anatomy, something that didn't walk but slid, or crawled, or writhed. Sleep became a battleground. Exhaustion pulled me under, only for the sounds to jerk me awake, heart hammering, ears straining in the oppressive dark, every fiber screaming that something was down there, listening, waiting, moving in the shadows just inches below my floor. Paranoia became my constant companion. I walked on tiptoe, flinched at every natural creak of the old house, found myself holding my breath for minutes at a time, listening, always listening. The boundary between my apartment and his dissolving into a membrane of sheer terror. The breaking point came last Thursday. I'd lain awake until dawn, tormented by an hour of frantic, skittering whispers that seemed to dart just under the surface of the floor, like rats trapped in the walls, but faster, more erratic, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic thumping, like a slow, weak pulse transmitted through the wood. Utterly drained, I finally drifted into a shallow, nightmare-plagued sleep as gray morning light filtered through the grimy windows. A loud metallic clang from the trash bins in the alley below jolted me awake around 8 a.m., my nerves instantly frayed. I stumbled to the door, needing air, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere of my own home. The silence from below now feeling like a held breath. As I reached for the deadbolt, I heard it. A distinct, dry, shuffling sound from the hallway, right outside my door, like bare feet dragging slowly across the worn runner carpet. My blood turned to ice. Instinct screamed, "Don't open it." But a perverse, terrified curiosity glued my eye to the cold brass peephole, warping the dimly lit hallway into a fishbowl view. The shuffling stopped. Silence. Then, the door to 1B, directly across and down the short landing, emitted a faint click, It inched open, just a crack, maybe 2 inches, revealing nothing but deeper darkness within. Time stopped. My breath caught in my throat, raw and painful. Then it emerged. Slowly, impossibly, a hand slid out from the darkness of the doorway. It was unnervingly long, the fingers grotesquely slender and knobby, like bleached driftwood stripped of flesh, ending in thick, yellowed nails, curved like talons. The skin wasn't just pale. It was the color of something long submerged, a waxy, bloodless gray-white, mottled with faint, bruise-like discolorations. It moved with a terrible, deliberate slowness, groping blindly, spider-like across the coarse weave of the welcome mat just outside Mr. Armitage's door. The fingertips traced the bristles, tapped lightly, experimentally, on the worn wood of the threshold, a gesture both alien and obscenely curious, violating the mundane object with its unnatural presence. It lingered for an eternity, maybe 10 seconds, feeling the mat, the doorframe, the very air, before withdrawing just as slowly, vanishing back into the impenetrable gloom of apartment 1B. The door clicked softly shut. I remained frozen at my peephole, trembling violently, nausea rising in a sour wave. The image of that ghastly, searching hand burned onto my retinas. The silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, pregnant with unthinkable horrors, lurking just beyond a thin layer of wood and plaster. Mr. Armitage wasn't quiet. He was something else entirely. Something that didn't make human noise because it wasn't human. Something that explored its new territory in the dead of night, scraping against the barrier separating us, crawling across its ceiling, my floor with an unsettling fluidity. Something that felt its surroundings with a cold, inhuman hand. The rationalizations were ash. The scratching wasn't pipes. The shushing wasn't a carpet cleaner. The thing in 1B was aware. It was active, and it was curious. The profound silence he'd promised wasn't courtesy. It was predation. The old house groaned around me, but the sounds were different now. Every creak felt like a signal, every pipe rattle like a response from below. The thin floorboards were no longer just wood. They were a fragile lid over a box containing something unspeakable. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow in my apartment deepened, stretching toward corners where the weak light didn't quite reach. The air felt thick, stale, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent I hadn't noticed before. Damp earth, old paper, and something vaguely metallic, like dried copper, seeping up through the cracks around the baseboards. Was it my imagination fueled by terror, or was it real? Did it drift up from his space? I started mapping the sounds, a futile attempt to impose order on the nightmare. The scratching usually began shortly after midnight, often beneath the bedroom, sometimes shifting to the living room area. The shushing, dragging sound favored the space directly below my small kitchenette. The frantic skittering seemed random, chaotic, darting from point to point as if multiple small somethings were exploring the underside of my world. The rhythmic thumping was rarer, deeper, seeming to emanate from a central point, perhaps beneath the hallway outside the bedrooms. And the hand had emerged right at his front door, feeling the boundary between his domain and the shared space of the building. What did it want? Why feel the mat? Was it testing the texture, the temperature, or was it marking territory, claiming the threshold? Was it checking for obstacles, for prey? The questions looped endlessly in my head, a carousel of dread. I avoided the hallway like it was mined. Groceries were delivered, left outside my door. I stopped checking the mail. My world shrank to the confines of my apartment. A gilded cage with a monster beneath the floor. I scrutinized every inch of my own space, searching for signs of intrusion scratches I hadn't noticed before. Were they new? Faint indentations on the carpet near the walls, pressure from below, a subtle warping of the floorboard near the radiator, moisture or something pushing up. Paranoia painted everything with suspicion. My own reflection in the darkened window at night startled me. A pale, wide-eyed ghost, trapped in the glass. Days blurred into nights, each sunset bringing a fresh wave of suffocating anxiety. I took to sleeping on my lumpy sofa in the living room, as far from the bedroom's scraping epicenter as possible. A baseball bat gripped tightly in my hand, a pathetic weapon against the unknown. One rain-lashed night, the sounds escalated. The scratching was sharper, more frenzied, like claws trying to gouge through the plaster. The dragging sound was replaced by a heavier, wetter thud, slide, thud, accompanied by a low guttural rasp that wasn't a voice, but a vibration I felt in my teeth. A sound that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the bone. It seemed to circle directly below the sofa where I lay trembling. Blankets pulled over my head like a child. Bat held so tightly, my knuckles screamed. The thudding grew closer, rhythmic, deliberate. Thud, pause, slide, pause, thud. It stopped directly beneath me. The rasping sound intensified, becoming a wet, rhythmic clicking, like a giant insect mandibles working. I could feel a faint, localized warmth radiating up through the fabric of the sofa cushion against my back. I stopped breathing. Time stretched into an unbearable tautness. Then, a new sound. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the underside of the floorboard, right beneath my shoulder blade. 3 distinct impacts, sharp, like a knuckle rapping on wood. Testing, signaling, knock, knock, knock. My blood froze. It knew I was here. It knew exactly where I lay. The implications were paralyzing. This wasn't random nocturnal activity anymore. This was engagement. This was a horrifying attempt at contact from an entity inhabiting the space I naively called my neighbor's apartment. The tapping ceased. The wet clicking faded. The warmth dissipated. The silence returned, heavier and more terrifying than ever before. It was a silence that screamed awareness. It wasn't just occupying the space below. It was aware of the space above, aware of me, my movements, my presence, my fear. The thin barrier was meaningless. My sanctuary was an illusion. I was living atop an abyss, and the abyss had just knocked. The following days were a descent into a quiet, trembling madness. Sleep was impossible. Food tasted like ash. I jumped at the slightest noise within my own apartment. The fridge humming, a book settling on a shelf, the groan of a settling beam. My nerves were exposed wires, sparking with terror at every creak and groan, real or imagined. The silence from below became an active presence, a watchful void. I felt its attention like a physical pressure, a cold spot in the room, a prickling on the back of my neck when I stood near certain areas of the floor. I started talking to myself, low, frantic whispers, trying to fill the oppressive quiet, to convince myself I wasn't alone, even as the terrifying certainty grew that I was alone, utterly alone with it. The rational part of my brain, the part clinging to sanity by shredded fingernails, screamed that I needed evidence, that I had to know what I was dealing with. Contacting the police felt laughable. Officer, my neighbor is too quiet and I heard scratching. They'd write me off as a paranoid crank. Confronting Mr. Armitage was unthinkable. The memory of that pale, groping hand banished any thought of knocking on 1B's door. But I had to see. I had to know. Desperation breeds reckless courage. The building had an old coal chute access in the basement, long disused, boarded up, but rumored by the super to have a loose panel. If I could get into the basement, maybe I could find a way to peer into 1B's crawl space, see the underside of my own floor, see what was making the sounds. The plan was flimsy, dangerous, born of hysteria, but it was all I had. Late one afternoon, when the weak winter sun offered the illusion of safety, I slipped out of my apartment, moving like a ghost down the stairs, avoiding the fourth step that always groaned. The basement door was unlocked, as it often was. An old fire code violation the landlord ignored. The air below was thick with the smell of damp concrete, mildew, and ancient dust. Cobwebs draped like gray veils across rusted pipes and forgotten storage trunks. Dim bare bulbs cast long, dancing shadows. I found the coal chute access in the far corner, behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. The board covering it was indeed loose, secured by only a few rusty nails. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I worked it free, the screech of protesting nails echoing alarmingly loud in the cavernous space. I paused, breath held, listening for any sound from above, any sign that it had heard. Silence. I pulled the board aside, revealing a dark, narrow opening, maybe 2 feet high and 18 inches wide, smelling overwhelmingly of wet earth, decay, and something else, something sickly sweet and cloying, like spoiled fruit and mushrooms. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, its beam cutting a weak swath into the absolute blackness beyond the opening. This wasn't just a coal chute, it opened into a low earthen crawl space running under the building's foundations. Taking a shuddering breath, I dropped to my hands and knees in the cold, damp concrete biting through my jeans and crawled into the suffocating space. The air was frigid and thick, pressing down on me. My light beam bounced off rough-hewn stone foundations, thick spider webs, and patches of glistening, dark mold. The earth floor was uneven, littered with chunks of brick and smooth, worn stones. I crawled slowly, painfully towards where I estimated 1B would be directly above. The sweet rot smell intensified, mixed with a sharper, coppery tang that made my stomach churn. The crawl space seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and support pillars. Then I saw it. Ahead, under the approximate location of my living room, the earth was disturbed. Not just disturbed, excavated. A shallow pit, maybe 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, had been dug into the dirt floor. And around it, arranged with chilling precision, were bones, small bones, rodent bones, bird bones, maybe even a cat skull, picked clean, gleaming whitely in my trembling light beam. They were placed in a rough circle around the pit, like some grotesque shrine or boundary marker. In the center of the pit, the earth was dark, almost black, and looked unnaturally smooth, packed down. My breath hitched, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. This was no animal den. This was deliberate, ritualistic. My light beam darted around the pit, catching on something else embedded in the packed earth at its center. Protruding slightly, almost like a fossil emerging from dark sediment, was a long, thin object. I leaned closer, my heart threatening to burst through my chest. It was a finger bone. Human. Metacarpal. Too long, too slender to be normal. Bleached white and partially buried in the dark soil. The terror that washed over me was absolute. A cold wave that stopped my heart, then sent it crashing against my ribs. The sounds, the scratching, the dragging. The thing feeling its surroundings. It wasn't just in 1B, it was under it, under me. And it was building something, nesting, burying things, burying parts. The sweet rot smell suddenly overwhelmed me, triggering a gag reflex. I scrambled backwards, frantic, clawing at the dirt, desperate to get out, to get away from that pit, those bones, that buried finger. My elbow knocked against a loose stone, sending it clattering against a foundation pillar. The sound was deafening in the confined space. And then, stillness. An unnatural, watchful stillness. The oppressive silence of the crawl space deepened, becoming charged, electric. The hairs on my neck stood rigid. I froze, flashlight beams shaking wildly, illuminating swirling dust motes. From the darkness beyond the pit, from the direction leading further under the building, came a sound. A soft, wet inhalation. A sniffing, deliberate, curious. Like something large, hidden in the deeper blackness, had caught my scent on the damp, still air. It wasn't close, not yet, but it had heard. It knew I was here, invading its space. Panic exploded in my chest, pure, blinding terror. I didn't think, I acted. I scrambled backwards towards the chute opening, my movements clumsy, frantic, dislodging dirt and small stones. My breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that echoed horribly in the confined space. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare shine the light behind me. I focused solely on the dim rectangle of light marking the basement, crawling, scrambling, kicking, my clothes snagging on jagged stones, cobwebs clinging to my face. I burst out of the opening, stumbling onto the cold basement floor, gasping for air that still tasted of decay. I grabbed the discarded board, slamming it back over the chute opening with trembling hands, hammering at the rusty nails with the heel of my shoe, not caring about the noise, only wanting to seal it, to put a barrier between me and the thing that sniffed in the dark. The sound of my frantic hammering filled the basement, and then, as the last nail screeched home, a new sound cut through the din. Faint, muffled, coming from directly above me, from the floor of my apartment. A slow, deliberate scrape, 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 right above where I stood in the basement. It was moving, following my path. It knew I was down here. It knew I'd seen. Sealing the chute felt meaningless. The thin floorboards were nothing. It could be anywhere, above, below, in the walls. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, heavier, more menacing than ever. It was the silence of a predator assessing its prey. I fled the basement, taking the stairs two at a time, bursting into my apartment, slamming and deadbolting the door, leaning against it, chest heaving, the taste of fear metallic in my mouth. The apartment felt different, tainted. The air itself felt watched. The silence wasn't empty, it was occupied. Mr. Armitage wasn't my neighbor. He was the landlord for something else. Something that lived in the dark places. Something that dug pits and collected bones and listened through the floor. Something that knew I was afraid. Something that knew I knew. And the scratching hadn't been an attempt to get out. It had been an attempt to get in. The perfect downstairs neighbor wasn't quiet. He was patient. And my time, I knew with cold, absolute certainty, was running out. The thin barrier of wood and plaster and dirt was dissolving. It was coming up. The scraping sound started again that very night, not just beneath the floor, but seemingly within the walls. A dry, insistent rustling, like enormous insects moving behind the lath and plaster, converging, I was sure, towards the sealed chute in the basement, towards the weak points, towards me. The faint, sweet rot smell, once confined to the crawl space, now occasionally drifted through my vents, a chilling reminder of what lay below, of what was growing restless. Sleep is a distant memory. I sit now, bat in hand, back against the sturdiest wall, listening to the relentless, patient sounds of the thing that lives beneath, the thing that is no longer satisfied with just scratching. It wants more. It wants out. It wants in. And the silence between the sounds is the worst part, because it's the silence of something waiting, listening, planning its next move in the dark just inches away, separated only by this fragile, crumbling shell I used to call home. The knocking wasn't a greeting. It was a countdown. And the next sound I hear won't be from below. It will be from the other side of my door, or worse, from right behind me, in this room where the walls themselves seem to breathe with the presence of the perfect, patient, hungry neighbor below. The scratching has stopped again. The silence is absolute, heavy, listening, waiting. He is always there, always close, always silent, until he isn't. And when he isn't silent anymore, I fear the scratching will be the last sound I ever hear, replaced by the wet, clicking rasp I felt in my bones, coming from somewhere much, much closer. The floorboard near the radiator just creaked. Not a settling creak, a pressure creak. Something is pushing up. It's starting. He's coming up.